The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is one of my all-time favorite games. I'd put it in my top 3, up there with Hollow Knight and Paper Mario and the Thousand Year Door. In fact, I've beaten Breath of the Wild at least 4 times, pushing near the 1,000-hour mark in that game. This is despite the fact that Breath of the Wild has a pretty incredible amount of flaws. The base combat mechanics are mediocre, the menus are pretty convoluted, and the button scheming is pretty unbelievably bad. But what the game does well, it does so well that it makes up for its many, many flaws. At least it did for me. That's not to say that I ignore the problems with Breath of the Wild, just that the problems are massively outweighed by the incredible open world that the game presents you with. A lot of the critiques that I levy against Tears of the Kingdom in this video are going to be things that were also problems in Breath of the Wild. The obnoxious part is that Nintendo had an entire development cycle to remedy these issues present in Breath of the Wild, but failed to in Tears of the Kingdom. This results in Tears of the Kingdom ending up in a similar situation to Breath of the Wild. There are a lot of elements to like in Tears, but there's also many glaring flaws. The difference being that this time around, what this game does well didn't really make up for its flaws. And I'll acknowledge that for many people who are watching this video, you probably feel differently. A lot of people really love Tears of the Kingdom. I'd ask that as I go throughout this video, you hear me out and engage with my specific critiques of the game rather than my overall conclusion. I might think the game is bad, you might think the game is good, but we can still both agree on what problems the game has. Heck, that's what I did with Breath of the Wild. I know it has a lot of flaws, but I ended up really liking it anyway. But without further ado, let's talk about Tears of the Kingdom. Also, spoilers for like the entire game, nothing really story related, but just a heads up. There are a lot of different elements that you might really enjoy about Breath of the Wild. Some might really like the combat, others its puzzles, but I don't think it's really controversial to say that the focus of that game was its exploration. The map was beautifully crafted in a way to make exploring it feel kinda magical. While the game couldn't load detailed elements from far distances, it always made certain to show several landmarks and shrines from a distance to give you an objective to head towards. Many of the other game's systems fed into the exploration. If you look to the distance to see a snowy mountain you wanted to climb, you might spend time cooking food to keep warm, battling enemies to get gear, or venturing into nearby shrines to give you enough stamina to climb the mountain. You are able to complete smaller goals to accomplish larger ones, and usually you'd be paid off in some really interesting way. You see, for the joy of climbing that snowy mountain was rarely just getting to the top of it. On the trek to the summit, you're likely going to find a handful of meaningful secrets and experiences that rewarded your exploration, be that stepping on a rock that transforms into a boss, finding a unique piece of armor, or stumbling upon a corrupted dragon that you needed to save. Perhaps an inherent flaw to exploration as a gameplay focus is that you can only do it once. Once you discover something, that feeling of discovery can't be recaptured because you already know it's there. Whereas other forms of gameplay, such as combat, platforming, and story, are all things that can be enjoyed again and again on replay. So when it comes to making a Breath of the Wild sequel, the mission should be apparent. Create a new world to explore. Here is the cardinal sin that Tears of the Kingdom commits though, which is something that we cannot escape talking about. It reuses the same map as Breath of the Wild. Now, I do want to be clear. I don't think that reusing the same map as the previous game is a decision made out of something like laziness. There is a clear attempt here to change elements of the world of Hyrule and add a bunch of new content. Regardless, however, of what the intentions of the developers were, we have to analyze the end product that was given to us. And the end map ends up playing far too similar to Breath of the Wild for my taste. Admittedly, you could add a bunch more changes to the Tears of the Kingdom map, and I'd still have a fundamental problem with the reuse from the last game. A game about exploration needs a new world to explore. The feeling of exploring the world and the excitement that comes when you find something new is completely gone in Tears of the Kingdom if you've already played Breath of the Wild. When you look out into the distance in Hyrule while playing Breath of the Wild, you'd likely be filled with this sense of curiosity. What's up on that volcano? What is this weird-looking location that's marked on my map? Why is there a glowing light at the top of that mountain? When you look out onto Hyrule in Tears of the Kingdom, you already know the answers to these questions, hampering the sense of curiosity and wonder. Instead, your thoughts are replaced with, I wonder if anything's changed, and I wonder if Nintendo will try and subvert my expectations. While these are also exciting propositions, they don't nearly capture the same sense of excitement from exploring an entirely new world. And while each and every area is changed in some way, those changes rarely subvert my expectations in any substantial way. Because this is a, entirely new game, I expect there to be some changes in each village and large area. But never was a reveal so meaningful that it felt like a subversive experience. Imagine if the volcano in Elden Mountain collapsed during the upheaval and all the Gorons now had to live down in the depths. Imagine if the Rito had to flee from their village and establish a settlement up in the sky. Imagine if the Yiga clan overtook Gerudo Town and now it was like this male-only Yiga base of operations. Things have changed since Breath of the Wild, but they've only changed in ways that are small and insubstantial and that you could have expected going into things. The dragons still fly around, but they are underground now. The mazes are still there, they just also have a sky section. Kakariko still sells the same stealth armor. This time around, there's just a side quest to reduce its cost. The best few hours you'll likely have exploring are the first few, before you have time to realize the game really has no new tricks up its sleeve. And this is ironic considering how samey those first few hours were to Breath of the Wild. The tutorial area takes place in the sky, deliberately hiding the rest of the content from you. The tutorial is identical to the Great Plateau in Breath of the Wild. The ghost of an old king tasks you with conquering 4 shrines, each of which give you a new ability. While I was still in this honeymoon phase with the game, I thought Nintendo was trying to subvert my expectations. The tutorial structure was so similar to Breath of the Wild's that I thought it was lulling me into the structure from the last game before I dropped down into Hyrule into the brand new experience. I could only wonder at what awaited me below. I thought that these would be the only 4 shrines in the game, which would be replaced with larger dungeons down below. I thought that maybe like the old Hyrule map would be but one in a much larger expanded world. I had so many thoughts about what Nintendo could have potentially done to change the game. And then I landed. Nothing had changed. Hyrule was more or less the same. The tutorial was so painfully similar to Breath of the Wild that I was sure Nintendo was setting the player up to subvert their expectations. But no, it's just the same experience. Round 2. To be clear, I don't think it's impossible for a game to reuse the same map and be really good. A pointed comparison would be to God of War Ragnarok. It should be noted that the reused map in Ragnarok has a much wider gap of changes from God of War 2018 to itself than Breath of the Wild does to Tears of the Kingdom, and it has considerably more new areas than Tears. But for the sake of the argument, to help out Tears, let's just assume that Ragnarok is also utilizing the same map as the previous game. Ragnarok can get away with reusing elements of the same map because it's a game that's primary focus is on story and combat. Both of these objectives can be achieved even if Ragnarok reused the same map as God of War 2018, pixel for pixel. Ragnarok manages to tell a completely new and exciting narrative and has substantial changes to its combat and enemy variety that aren't impaired by reusing elements of the map from its predecessor. But a game like Tears of the Kingdom that focuses on exploration can't use the same map. It's antithetical to the experience. Since Ragnarok is a combat-focused game, it would be like if you played God of War Ragnarok and they reused most of the same enemies, boss fights, and combos as the last game, with minor tweaks to the system. Or a platformer that reuses the same obstacles, or a puzzle game that reuses the same puzzles. The map in Breath of the Wild was good, I really enjoyed it, but I want something new to explore. And look, even though I do think that reusing the map is inexcusably bad, let's focus on what is actually here. Was Nintendo able to transform Hyrule into a meaningfully different experience? Well, to do that, let me describe this game to you. In this game, the main quest starts with Ganondorf corrupting Hyrule Castle. In order to gather enough strength to defeat Ganon, you must travel to 4 villages across the map. After meeting with an important figure from the village, you and your companion take on a dungeon, and after beating it, a fallen figure from the past grants your companion a specific power. Alongside these quests, Link embarks on a journey to recover the Master Sword. And on his way to each of these objectives, he activates Sky Towers, clears shrines for increased stats, and solves Korok puzzles to increase item slots. Now, did I just describe the structure of Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom? The correct answer is that I described both. Not only does Tears of the Kingdom reuse the same map, it has the exact same structure as Breath of the Wild. In isolation, I don't really have a problem with reusing that same structure. If it were put in another faraway land, you had to travel to 4 new villages, meet some new characters, and solve shrines and Koroks along the way, I would really enjoy that experience. The problem is that they reuse the same structure on the same map. It's the same goddamn game. There is no consideration for meaningful changes to the formula. For the main campaign, they make you go to the same 4 villages on the map that you did in the last game. I mean, imagine in Tears if instead of going back to Gerudo Town and to the Zora domain, you instead had the 4 main quest lines take place in Kakariko, Hateno, Laurelin, and Terrytown. Imagine if the final climactic battle took place at the peak of like Eldin Volcano, or maybe up high in the Sky Islands. There is so much you could do with this map, but instead, Nintendo opted to give us a nearly identical experience to the first game. Why change it if it already makes money? As you're exploring Hyrule, traversing the same fields, collecting the same armor sets, talking to the same NPCs, being attacked by the same Yiga clan members, things will start to feel like a retread of Breath of the Wild. But even though the game is identically structured to Breath of the Wild, there is a lot of new content here. A full game's worth, I'd say. There's an expanded underground and sky area, there are 152 new shrines, there's brand new dungeons, and a few new enemy designs. If we're engaging in the metric of game cost versus new content, which is a metric I don't really love, we could definitely say that there's enough here to justify a full game price tag. However, what might contribute to the feeling of sameness to Breath of the Wild is that in addition to all of the content in this game, there is also almost all of the content from Breath of the Wild. Since Nintendo is reusing the same map, that comes with its own set of expectations. I have a feeling that Nintendo wanted to avoid the world feeling incomplete for leaving out any details that were present in the last game. Meaning that if there was a secret, location, NPC, mechanic, or item, Nintendo had to either include it or tweak it in some way. Besides the 4 divine beasts and the shrines from Breath of the Wild, almost all of the content from that game is also going to be present in Tears. All of the armor sets, including DLC, the Great Fairies, the Leviathan Bones, the 3 mazes, the stables, Hyrule Castle, each and every village, every enemy type. If it was in Breath of the Wild, it's likely also here in Tears of the Kingdom. This means that everything you did in the first game, you're sure to do again on your second playthrough. Let me give you an analogy to back up my point. One of my all-time favorite movies is The Lord of the Rings: Fellowship of the Ring, the first movie. It's a great film. And a few years after its release, New Line Cinema released the Fellowship of the Ring Extended Edition, a great version of the movie with a lot of new content. However, if New Line decided to call the Extended Edition The Lord of the Rings 2, and then never released an actual sequel, I feel like a lot of people would be understandably disappointed. And maybe that's not a one-to-one analogy. Let me give you another one. I don't think anyone would argue that the primary focus of the new Super Mario Bros. Series is platforming. Now, imagine if Nintendo makes a sequel to, like, New Super Mario Bros. U, and this sequel has the same 8 worlds as the last game. In each level, it reuses 75% of the platforms, plus like in about 25% new platforms in each of them. In addition to the 8 worlds, there are also 2 brand new worlds. Now, if they release this as a full-on game, would people take this seriously as like a new proper sequel, or would people rightfully complain that it reuses so much of the content from the last game? But I've been sort of tiptoeing around it, and there is a lot of new stuff here. You might argue that this game isn't just mainland Hyrule. There is a bunch of new content added onto this world. And you're right. There are 3 sections of the map that are each entirely new: the caves, the Sky Islands, and the depths. I want to address each of them separately and discuss why I don't feel any of them substantively add to the experience of Tears of the Kingdom or adds enough new content to nullify my critiques of the reused overworld. Let's start with the caves. Scattered throughout the map of Hyrule are small cave systems, 147 in total. You can stumble upon the entrances to caves via mountainsides or through just a pile of rubble. But Tears of the Kingdom also makes this really brilliant decision of placing a shining blue bloopy outside of most caves, making it really easy and simple to spot one in the distance and then discover a nearby cave. These caves vary in length, but are mostly short, containing several enemy encounters, a hidden frog that can be hit to get a bubble gem, and very rarely you'll find one that contains a piece of armor. The quality of content in these caves are fairly low, each probably being about like half of the length of a shrine at best. And the primary content is just going to be a couple of reused enemy fights and again searching for that bubble gem. There are rarely any puzzles or intricacies to these caves. That being said, they're a somewhat welcome addition to at least be something new to do while you're in Hyrule. However, I would rather have 10 really long and intricate cave systems than the 147 low-quality ones found throughout the map. The best cave system in the game is below Hyrule Castle, and it involves you traversing the castle ruins and also several cave systems. I would have liked to see more caves like this one. As is, the quality of cave content is low and definitely does not add enough of anything new to outweigh the reused main map. That brings us to the second new area in the game, the Sky Islands. The tutorial of the game takes place on one such island, namely the Great Sky Island. And it's sad to say that not a single area in the rest of the sky is of a comparable size or complexity to this tutorial area. While islands are scattered throughout the entirety of the Sky of Hyrule, they make up a comparatively much smaller section of the main map, being roughly comparable to one large zone like Gerudo Desert or the Hebra Mountains. Given the heavy emphasis on the sky in advertising the game, I'm willing to bet that many players like myself found the Sky Islands to be one of the game's biggest disappointments. And I think I can summarize these frustrations in 2 key points: the lack of integration with the main game, and lackluster rewards for exploring them. The traversal between the Sky Islands and main Hyrule is incredibly fun and exciting. Diving off of a sky island only to land near a sky tower, then launch yourself back up into the air, it's an incredibly fun experience. However, there's rarely a reason to do this due to there not really being a lot of reasons to even traverse the sky. Outside of 2 mainline dungeons which exist in the sky, the main story never gives you a reason to explore the Sky Island. This is because they are completely segregated from the main map. In Tears of the Kingdom, if I want to get to Gerudo Town to complete the main quest, I have to traverse either the Gerudo Highlands, track through the desert, and survive a vision-impairing sandstorm. All of these locations could clearly be considered part of the main game, as you have to physically traverse them, or at least a portion of them, to get to the game's main objectives. However, the Sky Islands are, well, in the sky. And there are no villages or main quest objectives, outside of those 2 dungeons, that force you to engage with the content up in the air. It's made more obvious that the developers don't force you to explore the sky, considering how bare bones each island really feels. And this leads to my second critique of the Sky Islands: a lackluster reward for exploring them. One of my first experiences with the Sky Islands was after launching myself up into the sky via a sky tower. I landed near a shrine that was closed off to me. To access the shrine, I needed to bring a crystal to its entrance, which I found a few small islands away. This experience was pretty interesting, and it had me hopping between the islands in the way that I had hoped. My disappointment grew after I presented the crystal and opened the shrine. I realized that inside of the shrine, there was no puzzle, simply a reward. My disappointment grew more after my trip to the next Sky Island, where I was presented with the same crystal puzzle. Of the 32 shrines that you'll find up in the sky, you will be doing this crystal puzzle for almost all of them. And that's not to include the several times it's repeated on the ground level. These crystal fetch quests make up the majority of content in the sky. And even when you're not doing them, when you think you're doing something that piques your interest, it's rarely unique. This single island was so far in the distance that it piqued my interest. I wasted at least like a third of my Zonai charges to get enough fuel to make it to this thing. The only reward was a slightly modified version of a mid-boss that I fought dozens of times before. Not only that, but this island is repeated 3 times in the sky, not even a unique experience. Outside of the Stormhead Isles, which I later discovered was main quest content anyway, there was never a reason for me to be in the sky. Nintendo made no attempt to make me want to clear this content. It was clearly relegated to the same level of optional side content as the cave systems. Third and final of the new content is the Depths. This is the one that I expect to be the primary example that Tears defenders will use to justify the reuse of the open world. The Depths is a secondary map, directly below the surface of Hyrule. At first glance, the Depths is a perfect counter to my argument about the reuse of content. If I was mad that they reused the same map, well, here's a second map that's literally the same size as the last one. But I think this argument is really disingenuous. Interestingly, it's really easy for a developer to create a bigger map. Games like No Man's Sky or the Chalice dungeons in Bloodborne are procedurally generated, and therefore have maps that are infinitely large. Even without procedural generation, the developers could also just make a flat surface that extends 10 times the length of the map, and as long as you have access to it, boom, there you go, you just made a bigger map. My point is it's not how big you make the map, it's how meaningful you make the content in that map. While the depths might have the same height, length, and width of Hyrule, it has a far smaller density of content. On the surface, there are several main quest lines, not to mention 139 side quests, 152 shrines, almost 1,000 Koroks, caves, unique encounters. It's a densely packed map. The depths has none of this. There is one large side adventure and one side mission in the entirety of the depths. There are also no shrines. Instead, each shrine is replaced with a light route, which has no puzzle attached to it at all, only a button to press to light up the surrounding area. The majority of content in the depths consists of copy and pasted enemy encampments, the same 5 Yiga Fortress templates which guard a vehicle schematic, a small mine area with a piece of armor, a platform with a rematch with one of the 4 main game bosses, or the occasional Colosseum fight, where you fight a series of basic enemies to unlock a piece of armor that was already available in Breath of the Wild. Like the Sky Islands, the depths are completely isolated from the main story. There are, like the Sky Island, 2 mainline dungeons down here, and outside of that, there's no real reason to be down here. Throughout the entirety of my time exploring the depths, I kept waiting for meaningful rewards for exploration, and they always failed to meet them. This is for several reasons. 1, the entire depths is given the same biome of visual design. Part of the joy of exploring in the overworld is exploring the different deserts, volcanoes, mountains, and plateaus that the game has to show you. But down here, it's nothing but caves and darkness. Critics already complained enough that Breath of the Wild had too many grassland areas, and if you believe that, then it's pretty hard to defend the depths. It also becomes less meaningful to explore when you realize that the entirety of the depths is a mirror of the overworld. This isn't a separate map with its own design sensibilities taken into account. Instead, the developers are limited in what they can do with this area because it has to perfectly mirror the overworld. I made the grave mistake of exploring the depths early on in my playthrough. After I landed on Hyrule, I went towards Kakariko, only to find the same few stables on my way, solve the same types of Korok puzzles, and eventually open the shop door and see the same stealth armor available from the last game. I was kind of fed up with the surface, and I decided to explore the depths. Several hours into exploring, I stumbled across a massive stone building. It even had its own unique logo on the map. The Spirit Temple. I was thrilled to find that there are entire dungeons that you can just stumble upon while playing this game. Again, my curiosity went wild. Well, how many dungeons are there? How do I even get into this one? Now, if you've played the game, you'll know how naive I'm being, and how I made a grave mistake by discovering this temple so early, and how it vastly warped my expectations. You see, this temple wasn't something that you could just stumble upon and access. It's one of the 5 dungeons of the main campaign, and you can't access it until you progress through the main story. Everywhere I went from then on, I had the expectation of discovering entire optional dungeons, something that it turns out are just not in the game. I then went on to clear nearly the entirety of the depths, hoping with each light route I could reveal some hidden dungeon that I wasn't even supposed to find until I was a much higher level. And as I cleared 80, 90, 95% of the depths, I realized the same thing I did about the sky. This was side content. The caves, the Sky Islands, the depths are nice, but they're not a meaningful replacement for a new map. Each of these areas is filled with low-quality content that has no satisfying rewards for exploring them. But look, even if the world isn't as exciting to explore this time around, let's talk about the tools that Link now has to explore it. Link's base mechanics when he first hops out of the Shrine of Resurrection in Breath of the Wild are quite limited. He can run, climb up walls, and use weapons. Where the real spice comes in are the abilities that Link unlocks throughout the tutorial. In both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, Link leaves the tutorial with 4 abilities. These abilities can be used for both exploration and combat in the overworld, as well as tools that Link can use to solve puzzles in the game's shrines and dungeons. In this section, I want to discuss how Tears of the Kingdom iterates on and changes the abilities from Breath of the Wild. Particularly, I want to discuss how these abilities contribute to the primary task of exploration in the game. In order to do this though, I want to describe the abilities in Breath of the Wild to give us the new abilities something to compare them to. The first ability you'll learn in Breath of the Wild is Magnesis. Magnesis allows you to freely move magnetic structures. This is a pretty good ability, with an incredible amount of applications. You can use it to open doors, assemble platforms, and even use spiked balls as weapons. The second ability is the Remote Bomb, which allows Link to create either a spherical or cubed explosive that he can plant and then remotely detonate. While seemingly simple at first, the Remote Bomb also has a lot of uses. The explosion can destroy rocks and debris, and the fact that the bomb is a physical object means it can be used to weigh down switches. The third ability is Stasis, which allows Link to stop time on a certain object, freezing it in place. This ability is integrated well enough into the shrines. While there are several applications for the ability, you'll most often be using it to fling objects in other directions by hitting it several times with a weapon. The final and worst ability in Breath of the Wild is Cryosis, which allows Link to freeze a portion of the water, creating a platform for him to climb on. Joseph Anderson states this well in his critique of Breath of the Wild, but Cryosis fails because of its limited applications. If you see water in a shrine, you're going to have to use Cryosis. But if you don't see water, then you know you only really have 3 abilities at your disposal for puzzle solving. These 4 abilities are utilized reasonably well in both combat and puzzles. Remote Bombs, Magnesis, and Stasis are all valuable tools when taking on Bokoblin camps, especially when you unlock Stasis Plus, which allows Link to freeze enemies and not just objects. Likewise, the Shrine's puzzles will have you swapping between these abilities quite often, even if Cryosis is a bit underutilized. Where these Breath of the Wild abilities fall short is in their ability to facilitate exploration in the overworld. If the purpose of Breath of the Wild is to go and explore the world, I'm not really sure how well these 4 abilities help you do that. The bombs can be used to destroy boulders and reveal what's behind them, Cryosis can be used to traverse ponds, Magnesis is sometimes used to move a metal board out of the way. Overall though, these abilities are largely used in combat and puzzle solving, but not really when you're simply traversing the world. This brings us to Tears of the Kingdom. Tears of the Kingdom introduces 4 all-new abilities at the start of Link's adventure. The first is perhaps one of the biggest selling points of the game, Ultrahand. Ultrahand is similar to Magnesis in that it allows Link to move objects. However, Ultrahand can be used on things besides metal. In fact, most objects in the game can be controlled using Ultrahand. Additionally, Link can now stick objects together, usually creating platforms or vehicles that Link can use to traverse the world around him. The second ability is by far the strangest to me, Fuse. Fuse allows Link to fuse other items in the game to his sword, shield, or arrows. In the first shrine where you receive the Fuse ability, Link finds a boulder on the floor. When fused to his sword, he is now able to break stone walls. The potential applications for the Fuse ability are many, and often not obvious. Link can fuse a minecart to his shield and use it to surf around with wheels. He can fuse a rocket to his shield to propel himself up in the air. He can fuse fire fruits to his bow to create fire arrows. He can fuse drop monster parts to his sword to increase its attack damage. It's a really widely varied ability. The third and fourth abilities are Rewind and Ascend. Rewind is a riff on Stasis, which causes an object to freeze in time and then move backwards. Ascend is a whole different animal, as it allows Link to move through ceilings to what's above them. The genius of the abilities in Tears of the Kingdom is that, unlike with Breath of the Wild's abilities, they are used to facilitate exploration in the overworld. Ultrahand can be used to build bridges, heck, even whole vehicles that allow you to traverse terrain. Fuse can be used in a myriad of ways to get around and clear obstacles in your path. Rewind, well, Rewind's a little more niche. But my favorite overworld ability has got to be Ascend. Ascend is simple in what it does, but it does it really well. Instead of having to open the menu and reload at the end of every cave system, with Ascend, you don't ever have to stop playing the game. There's a seamless transition from finishing one thing to starting the next. Joseph Anderson, in a stream of him playing the game, referred to this as keeping the party going, and I really think that's a good way to explain what Ascend does. As I explored the world, I had many moments with Ascend that I did kind of similar to like climbing a mountain in Breath of the Wild. I was looking over every surface above me to see if I could find an angle to cheese and use Ascend on. And more often than not, through sheer stubborn-headedness, I could. While Fuse, Rewind, and Ascend are all nice, with how much it's used in the game, it's not hard to see that Ultrahand is the defining mechanic of Tears of the Kingdom. And in a vacuum, I think it's a really neat ability that, theoretically, should make exploring the world even more fun and engaging. Unfortunately, I don't think Tears does a good enough job of fully capitalizing on Ultrahand's potential. To lay out my points here, I want to bring up a concept that Matthew Matosis touches on in his critique of Breath of the Wild. There are two types of motivations that developers can use to get players to accomplish a task: intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic motivation is when the reward for doing something is the act of doing it. Extrinsic motivation is when the reward for doing something is a physical reward at the end of the challenge. For example, let's say you have two different players approach an enemy bokoblin camp. Someone who is intrinsically motivated might clear the camp because they find the combat fun. The reward was getting to fight the enemies. Someone who is extrinsically motivated might clear the camp because of the chest you receive for clearing the encampment, whether it contains a valuable jewel or an important weapon. Ideally, a game should provide both intrinsic and extrinsic motivations for the player to complete tasks. The tasks in and of themselves should be fun to complete, and there should be satisfying rewards for completing them. However, I'm the kind of player that, unless the task is really incredibly fun, I need some sort of extrinsic motivation to complete it. This brings me to the Ultrahand ability. Tears rarely gives you an extrinsic motivation for using Ultrahand. Outside of doing a puzzle in a shrine, the game presents the player with two primary challenges. Either get from point A to point B, or clear an enemy encampment. Since the game utilizes such a sandbox design philosophy, the player is always given many ways to tackle these two challenges, Ultrahand usually being one of the most time-consuming and convoluted options. If I want to travel from a stable to a nearby mountain, I could take the time to build a carriage, equip wheels, propellers, steering controls to it, and build this really cool-looking vehicle. Or I could simply just hop on my horse and make it there in a fraction of the time. Likewise, if I wanted to clear an enemy encampment, I could spend a few minutes creating an elaborate death trap, the likes of which you've probably seen on TikTok. Or I could just rush into the camp, hit them with my sword, trigger the broken flurry rush mechanic, and head out. Thus, choosing to use Ultrahand for any given task is likely to be the most time-consuming and least efficient option at your disposal. You are given no extrinsic reward for taking the time to build an elaborate contraption. The rewards for clearing a camp with an Ultrahand vehicle, or just with your sword, are exactly the same. Instead, much of the joy from using Ultrahand is intrinsic. It can be immensely fun for a player to build a giant cart with a flamethrower penis. But said vehicle is so outclassed by Link just using a sword and shield that the reason you would create something like that is because, well, you like building funny little vehicles. I'm not really intrinsically motivated in this same way. If my reward for spending 3 minutes gathering the parts to assemble a vehicle is the same as if I were to run into the enemy camp and clear it in half the time, I'm the type of player who will just choose the more efficient route. Tears is a game that is more fun the more you choose to engage with its systems, but rarely will give you an extrinsic reward for doing so. Perhaps a potential extrinsic reward that the developers could have included was a combat score given at the end of each encampment, with higher scores being granted to players who take down enemies in more varied and complex ways. There could even be an occasional side quest where NPCs will ask you to take down a nearby encampment and will give you a reward if you clear that encampment with an A or an S rank. Ultimately, I think a system like this would ruin the immersion in the game, but I would prefer if there was some kind of reward given for using Ultrahand. For me, the mechanic of Ultrahand is really good on paper. In fact, it's an incredible mechanic. But this kind of open world just isn't designed to best use the ability. If Tears was a linear game, with a series of levels, each containing within them puzzles and combat encounters that required Link to use Ultrahand to complete them, I think it would be a genuinely great game. But because Ultrahand is just one way, and usually the most convoluted way, to solve a problem, I just don't really think it works here. What's worse is that when I did try to engage with Ultrahand, I felt like I was being punished for doing so. Ultrahand vehicles seem like an incredibly poor way to travel in tiers. The first problem is finding the resources you need to build the type of vehicle you want. When you come across a pile of parts in the wild, the game does a pretty good job of usually providing you with enough of them to build whatever it is you're looking for. If you want to build a car, there's usually 4 tires and a plank laying around. But if you're a part short, you have to spend permanent resources which you may or may not have on you. Like with weapon durability, this usually means players will save their vehicle parts in anticipation of a crucial situation that will never come. Once you've built your vehicle, now you'll have to deal with your battery charge. Each vehicle can only be piloted for a matter of seconds before its battery runs out. From there is a substantial cooldown period before you can pilot your vehicle again. The 2 ways to circumvent this are either by using zonite charges, another permanent resource, or by upgrading your battery charge, which was something that I didn't even realize that you could do until 80 hours into the game. After all of this work, you won't even be keeping your vehicle for long. Whenever you die or load a new save, your vehicle will vanish. All of these factors come together to discourage players from using Ultrahand rather than encouraging them. A potential solution to this problem could be registering vehicles in stables, similar to horses. Or if the flavor of that doesn't really fit, perhaps zonai construction sites that function similar to stables around the world. And yes, Link does gain an ability later that emulates what I'm talking about, but it's hidden until the late game, and it also uses a permanent resource each time you want to create one of your saved vehicles. The areas where I had the most fun using vehicles were on the Sky Islands. Unlike in the overworld, these levels felt like they were specifically designed with Ultrahand in mind. Because there are massive, unwalkable distances between each Sky Island, it forces the player to use Ultrahand, instead of making it a choice. While the sky was my favorite place to use Ultrahand, it also felt like an underdeveloped use of the ability. Again, there is no extrinsic motivation for creating more creative and complex vehicles. Instead, you will likely be creating either a hoverbike, bird with 2 propellers, or hot air balloon with rockets as your vehicle of choice on every Sky Island. Ultimately, I think how you approach Ultrahand will determine your overall enjoyment of the game. If you're a player who feels a great degree of satisfaction in assembling funny little vehicles to create entertaining scenarios, then I could see you really enjoying the moment-to-moment gameplay of Tears of the Kingdom. However, if like me, you're not as intrinsically motivated by creating funny little things, then I imagine that their emphasis in Tears of the Kingdom will come as a disappointment. All of that being said, there is another purpose for Link's new abilities outside of exploration. Let's talk about the shrines. Puzzles have always been an integral part of Zelda games. Before the dawn of Zelda on the Switch, the primary method of delivering puzzles were dungeons, which were long-form castles and temples found at the end of a level. With the new open-world model, Breath of the Wild decided to divide puzzles more evenly, opting for smaller dungeons called shrines, which were heavily populated throughout the world. Each shrine served as a miniature dungeon, where you had to solve anywhere from around 1 to 3 puzzles to progress through it, each containing the reward of a blessing, which you can trade 4 of in to increase your choice of either max health or stamina. I was not really a fan of shrines in Breath of the Wild, as they were simply too short. You will usually be presented with an opening puzzle that will explain the shrine's mechanics, a second puzzle that increases in difficulty or adds a new element, and, if you're lucky, a third puzzle that really brings everything together. Because these shrines are so short, the puzzles can never really get that interesting. This basic design philosophy carries through to Tears of the Kingdom. Shrines are still short, simple dungeons with a handful of puzzles in them. While I don't really find the shrines to be that interesting in either game, I think the shrines in Tears of the Kingdom are worse than those found in Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild had a pretty large range in quality from what you'd receive when you walked into a shrine, with most of them being pretty mid, still a lot of them being really bad, but a few of them being pretty good. Instead of expanding upon these few good outlier shrines in Breath of the Wild, Tears has just cut them out entirely. To break this down, I want to discuss the shrines in detail. Alright, numbers time. In Tears of the Kingdom, there are 152 shrines, compared to Breath of the Wild's 120. However, the 152 number is quite misleading. 52 out of the 152 shrines, which is over a third, are what are known as Raru's Blessings, which are simply a treasure chest in an otherwise empty room. Most of these 52 Raru's Blessing shrines come at the end of a puzzle or riddle in the overworld, Not all of them do, but most of them do. And it could be argued that the shrine is the lead up to it, whatever puzzle you do in the overworld, and the inside, the blessing, is just the reward. Regardless, that means only 100 out of the 152 shrines actually contain puzzles within them. There are also 7 combat training shrines. These shrines are merely tutorials, teaching you basic mechanics about combat, mechanics which you should probably already know from the first game. What's worse is that not all of these 7 combat shrines are located in the early game. You can be accessing a shrine in the far corner of the map and be presented with a tutorial for a mechanic you've likely already mastered by then. Subtracting the 7 tutorial shrines brings us to 93 shrines. 15 of these 93 shrines are Proving Ground challenges. In each Proving Ground, you are stripped of all of your gear and forced to clear a room full of enemies. In these challenges, you must scavenge the room for weapons and equipment to turn the tides against the enemies that are found around you. There's clear influence from Breath of the Wild's Eventide Isle, which was highly regarded as one of the best segments of that game. The Proving Grounds stand out as the best shrine content in Tears of the Kingdom. Each sequence is pretty well balanced and usually introduces some mechanic to make each Proving Grounds feel different from one another. If we subtract the Proving Ground shrines, which overall I don't really have much to complain about, we are left with 79 shrines that actually contain puzzles. These 79 shrines are where our abilities of Ultrahand, Ascend, and Rewind come into play. But as I said earlier, each of the shrines doesn't last long enough to use the abilities in complex and interesting ways. I went and replayed all 79 of these puzzle shrines and put them into 4 categories. Shrines with 1 puzzle, shrines with 2 puzzles, shrines that have 3, and then anything more than 3, which in this case only ever led up to 4 total puzzles. Some of these shrines were obviously hard to fit into this metric. Some shrines like Courage to Jump are essentially one long sequence, but are longer than some shrines with 3 puzzles in them. Ultimately, this is just a rough estimate to hopefully show you how long you're going to be spent engaging with the content in the shrines. Of these 79 shrines, there are only 4 shrines that have a total of 4 puzzles in them. These are the most complex these shrines will ever get. And that is being as generous as possible for what I consider a puzzle. Simply dragging a block into place, which is a route action that you're going to do all the time, I even counted as a puzzle. Down from there, 29 of the 79 shrines contained 3 puzzles within them. In each of these 3 puzzle shrines, one of them was really a really basic puzzle that was hardly even a puzzle and more was just trying to get you familiar with the mechanic of the shrine. There were also 29 of 79 shrines that had only 2 puzzles in them, and a staggering 16 shrines only contained a single puzzle. This metric isn't perfect though for determining how much the shrines are actually fun to play, as I actually enjoyed some of the shrines with only 1 puzzle, while some of the shrines with 3 simple puzzles were over in a handful of seconds. Thus, I also ranked each of the puzzle shrines on a scale of good, mid, or bad. This is incredibly subjective, as many people will have fun with the shrines that I didn't. But for me to determine what made a good shrine, I usually counted how long it was and also how complex it was. Of the 79 puzzle shrines, I found exactly 40 of them, the vast majority, to be mid. These were usually just mindless shrines with a few puzzles with incredibly simple answers. I also found a whopping 31 of these shrines to be outright bad. These were either because there was only 1 puzzle, the puzzles inside were just incredibly basic, or they repeated something that the other shrines already did. Some of these bad tier shrines could also just be invalidated entirely, thus the puzzle was not that engaging. I only found 7 of the 79 puzzle shrines to actually be what I would call good, and that's being generous. These include Buried Light, Bridging the Sands, Hidden Metal, Courage to Fall, Built for Rails, Forward Force, and Shining in Darkness. Now, I'm ranking these shrines on a curve. The 7 good shrines are 7 shrines that I consider good within the context of Tears of the Kingdom. If we were to broaden our scope of what a good puzzle is, I don't think there is a single good shrine in the game, comparing that to either Breath of the Wild or other puzzle games. The Proving Ground shrines were the only enjoyable shrine content, and were still not that complex. I legitimately don't think that any of these shrines were any good at all. What's worse is that Breath of the Wild actually had several complex shrines with more puzzles. Granted, these shrines were the outlier in that game. But instead of adding more of them, Tears of the Kingdom has removed these more complex shrines entirely. I don't think it's really controversial to say that the hands-down best shrine in Breath of the Wild was the blue flame puzzle in the Shoraha shrine. This shrine has Link using a torch to carry a blue flame through a series of obstacles, all the way to the end of the shrine. What makes this shrine stand out amongst many others in Breath of the Wild was just how complex it was. It introduces a concept at the start of the shrine, which was to bring the blue flame from point A to point B. But because the shrine is longer, it allows for more complex and interesting iterations on that idea. The Blue Flame Shrine is the perfect example of what I'm looking for in these shrines, and something that's just not at all present in Tears of the Kingdom. Instead of 79 simple puzzle shrines, I'd much rather 12 or so larger shrine dungeons with more meaningful content within them. One shrine that gets close to introducing the potential that I saw in that Blue Flame Shrine in Tears of the Kingdom was the Buried Light Shrine outside of Gerudo Town. Like with the Blue Flame, the shrine introduces an interesting mechanic, this time using a fan to blow away piles of sand, only to find reflective mirrors which can be arranged in specific ways to trigger a sensor. But while ideas like this have a lot of potential, the shrine really ends before it's even able to get started. The reduced number of puzzles aren't the only thing about these shrines that I feel makes them worse though. There's two key aspects that I feel really bring down the shrine puzzles in Tears of the Kingdom. One, Link's abilities this time around don't really make for interesting puzzles. And two, the sandbox design philosophy completely breaks the balance of a lot of the puzzles. Let's start with the first point. While Link's new abilities in Tears do a much better job of helping him explore the overworld, I feel as though they just have a lot less depth when it comes to solving puzzles in shrines and dungeons. The first ability I'll dive into in this regard is Fuse. On paper, there are a near infinite amount of ways that developers can craft shrines around the Fuse mechanic. With so many potential options, this should be a great puzzle-solving ability. There is one massive problem with Fuse though. You need either a sword or a shield to use it. Because developers can't be sure that you have either of these when entering a shrine, they usually avoid making you use Fuse when you're actually in one. Outside of the first shrine when you use the Fuse ability to break the rock wall, I can only think of one other shrine that forces you to use it to get through it. The More Than Defense puzzle challenge in the Ijo-O shrine. There are still instances where you might use Fuse to solve a puzzle in a shrine. For example, instead of lighting a flame with a torch, you might use Fuse to light the flame with fire arrows instead. This means that Fuse is an option on the table, but puzzles are never really crafted around Fuse. And because the player quickly learns that Fuse is not one of the primary puzzle-solving tools, it essentially makes puzzles easier by limiting the potential solutions to just 3 abilities instead of 4: Ultrahand, Rewind, and Ascend. And with that, let's talk about Rewind and Ascend. These two abilities remind me a great deal of Cryosis in that they both have incredibly limited applications, and it's incredibly clear when you need to use them. Ascend only has one possible use: to move through the ceiling above you. Thus, there aren't many ways that the developers can use Ascend in an interesting way. It's also always clear when you'll need to use it. If there's a platform above you and nowhere else to go, it's super clear that you need to use Ascend. Because of its limited applications, many of the times shrines use Ascend, the goal of the developers is to make you forget that it's an option. The times I felt most clever using Ascend were in shrines where I felt like I was accessing an area that I wasn't supposed to. Rewind is a tad bit better than Ascend, in that while its primary use is also very clearly telegraphed, it actually does have a secondary one. The primary use of Rewind is to change the directions of platforms. If you see a platform moving in one direction, you immediately know you'll have to use Rewind. Likewise, if you don't see one, Rewind is usually off the table. The secondary, more interesting application of Rewind is to set up objects using Ultrahand and then rewind them to access areas you wouldn't otherwise be able to. In one sequence, also in the Buried Light Shrine, I placed a cube in the air with Ultrahand for several seconds. Then I rewinded it. Once it was dangling in the air, I was able to ascend through it to reach the top. This one instance was one of the only few where I was able to seamlessly combine my abilities to overcome a challenge. More often than not, Rewind is simply used to reverse the direction of gears and cogs, literally the first thing you are told to do when you receive the ability in the tutorial. The obvious ability with the most depth and complexity is of course Ultrahand. Fuse is almost always off the table. Ascend and Rewind have very limited applications. So for most of the shrines in this game, you'll be using Ultrahand to make your way through them. I talked at length in the previous section about how I wanted more segments where I was forced to use Ultrahand. However, these shrines actually utilize Ultrahand in a way worse than the overworld. Admittedly, the first few shrine puzzles that utilize Ultrahand actually feel really involved and complex. This is because Ultrahand is a complex ability, and learning all of its ins and outs takes a little bit of time. At around 20 hours into playing, when I understand how best to use Ultrahand, it became an incredibly easy tool to use, and thus puzzles utilizing it became far too easy to breeze through. I'm going to borrow another couple of concepts here from a couple other YouTubers, Feeble King and Matthew Matosis, who have also reviewed either Tears or Breath of the Wild. If you're presented with a puzzle where you already know the solution going into it, is there any actual puzzle solving involved? The answer is no. These are how many of the Ultrahand shrines felt in Tears of the Kingdom. You are only ever provided with the tools you will need to complete a task. If you see a gap you can't reach, and the only thing in front of you is a glider and 2 propellers, you know you need to build an aircraft to get over it. If you see a path you can't normally traverse, but you see a plank and 4 wheels, you know you need to build a car. Thus, there is no actual puzzle solving taking place. Instead, the time spent in the shrine is simply spent assembling the thing that you already knew you needed to build. One way that the developers could add difficulty to the Ultrahand puzzles is to add more noise to the shrines. Noise is anything that obscures the obvious solution to a puzzle. For example, if you're presented with a key and a lock, there's no real puzzle involved when it comes to opening the door. But if you're presented with 3 keys, each of them with different patterns, now you have a puzzle. In shrine puzzles, there is never any noise to distract you from what you were obviously supposed to do to solve the puzzle. Imagine if instead of being given only the parts you need to build a particular Ultrahand vehicle, you are given more than enough and instead have to trial and error your way through things. Even though there is a lot of depth that you could go into with the Ultrahand mechanic, Tears of the Kingdom never really decides to tap into any of it, instead making incredibly easy and repetitive puzzles. This brings me to my second reason why Tears has a lot worse shrines. The general puzzle solving design philosophy is handled worse. One aspect of Breath of the Wild that many, including myself, loved was the open-ended, sandbox approach that it took to puzzle solving. There was always an intended path when it came to solving each puzzle, but the developers never put up any barriers to prevent you from solving puzzles in novel or unintended ways. One memorable experience I had in Breath of the Wild was in an early shrine. The puzzle wanted you to place a bomb on a catapult that would launch it to the other side of the room where you could detonate it and trigger a sensor. However, you could also simply fling yourself across the shrine and glide to get the same result. Breath of the Wild constantly made me feel rewarded for experimenting with its mechanics. Oftentimes, when playing the game, you might have this thought like, there's no way this should work, only for you to try it and see that it does. Tears of the Kingdom expanded on this philosophy with mechanics like Ultrahand and Fuse. There are so many options with each ability that there are a massive number of ways to handle any puzzle. At first glance, this seems like a positive. If the open-endedness of Breath of the Wild's puzzles was a good thing, then more open-endedness must be an even better thing. But I think Breath of the Wild hit the right balance. There were usually several ways to tackle a puzzle, and when you used a non-conventional way of tackling it, it either meant that you still engaged with the mechanics of the puzzle, or you felt clever enough for being able to circumvent them. The problem with Tears of the Kingdom's puzzles is that solving them in unconventional ways usually means not engaging with the content at all. For example, almost every Ultrahand puzzle pushes you towards creating a unique vehicle or platform of some kind to advance. However, it is almost always easier to just assemble the pieces into a bridge to cheese most of the puzzle. This is made worse because once you move from one room to another, the next room is designed assuming the objects before it don't exist, providing you with more Ultrahand materials to use. The problem is, the materials in the room behind you do still exist. If you simply bring the objects from the previous room with you, you can create an ever-growing bridge that can invalidate a lot of puzzles. Another example which is just baffling to me was the fixed device puzzle in the Myashin Shrine. This one took me about 20 minutes by myself until I had to call a few friends to go help me out with it. It took us another 10 minutes to figure it out. The objective was to create a sort of like pinball bumper to hit the ball on the sensor at the end of the shrine. It was a decent puzzle and surprisingly hard considering how early it was in the game. A few days later, I was watching a stream of Smallant, a great Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom live streamer. And when he was playing, he was tackling the same puzzle. What I saw blew my mind. He fused a bomb arrow to his bow, shot the sensor, and the puzzle was solved. I genuinely have no idea how any of the game developers let this through. In isolation, as an innovative way to tackle this one shrine, I think the bomb arrow shortcut is fine. But these sensors are present in 10 other shrines, or roughly 14% of the 79 puzzle shrines. And now every time you see a sensor, you can just shoot it with a bomb arrow. This isn't an innovative alternative to solving these puzzles. This is a way of invalidating every single puzzle with a sensor. Once you have this knowledge, whenever you see a sensor shrine, you now have to choose to solve it. Just like you have to choose to not use Ultrahand to create a cheesy bridge. And these problems continue throughout the game. Every Hudson puzzle sign can be popped up with a floating platform. Every crystal puzzle, you can just take out your own Zonai devices and fly it across to where you need to go. They created a puzzle solving system with so many solutions that it has its own metagame. Some solutions are better and easier to achieve than others, and once you figure out what those are, you can use them to invalidate many of the puzzles in the game. All of this coming together, the shorter average length, the less complex abilities, the more open-ended puzzle design, led to what are, in my opinion, significantly worse shrines than those found in Breath of the Wild. I legitimately did not enjoy a single shrine outside of the Proving Grounds challenges. And as I was clearing these shrines, I started to realize that less and less of the game's content was actually quality content. There are two reasons to stop playing a video game. Either you got to its end, or you just got bored and decided to stop playing it. I firmly believe that the former is better than the latter. A game that I played recently that I absolutely loved was Bayonetta. It was a pretty great experience from start to finish. It took me about 20 hours to complete, had very little fat, and then I was done. I was finished. I was delivered a meaningful artistic experience by the game developers, and it ended on a high note. The other way to stop playing a game is because you simply got bored with it. Tedious late games like those found in Destiny and many MMOs have you repeating the same few bosses and missions over and over only to get marginally better loot. These types of games eventually become about the grind. Instead of allowing you a satisfying conclusion, these games vie for your time by making you complete monotonous content over and over until you simply get bored and tired of it. Instead of your last few hours with the game being those of enjoyment and climax, they are instead filled with frustration and tedium. This doesn't mean that games like this can't be good, or there isn't fun sometimes to be found in the grind, but I'm simply saying that I'd rather a game point towards a clear ending, conclude, and let me go on with my life. Breath of the Wild was a truly massive game, as, open worlds tend to be, with a massive amount of content. Besides the main questline, there are 120 shrines, many side quests, and 900 Koroks to find throughout the world. My first playthrough of Breath of the Wild, where I did all of the shrines, completed all of the side quests, and found about maybe 300 or so Koroks, took me about 130 hours to complete. And I feel that I can definitely divide that playtime into varying eras of quality. My first 50 or so hours with the game were phenomenal. I was blown away as I was discovering new areas, playing through the story, and exploring each and every corner of the map. The next 50 hours was me discovering and completing all of the shrines throughout the map. I still had a good time throughout, as exploring the world still felt novel, and there was enough well-kept secrets that I would discover something new and interesting in between every few shrines, but it was definitely not as good as those first 50 hours. My last 30 or so hours were dedicated to me completing all the side quests, and these last few hours were much less enjoyable. Many of the side quests were low-quality fetch quests that had me searching for items, and I only kept playing through these lulls to get what I felt was 100%, which to me, although this might not be how it is to others, was finishing all of the shrines and side quests. At around 130 hours, I felt pretty satisfied that I finished everything that I wanted to. The back half of my playtime was not as enjoyable as the first half, and I would have preferred a shorter game with higher quality content throughout, but I was ultimately happy at the end because I came to what I figured was a satisfying conclusion. Remember though, Tears of the Kingdom isn't just a bunch of new content, it also contains much of the same content from Breath of the Wild. This means that, in comparison, Tears blows Breath of the Wild out of the water when it comes to just the amount of sheer stuff to do. In Breath of the Wild, there was 120 shrines and 900 Koroks. But in Tears of the Kingdom, there's 152 shrines, 998 Koroks, and that's pretty comparable. But then you have 120 light routes to find in the depths, 156 caves to explore with 156 bubble gems throughout them. There's 82 President Hudson side puzzles to complete in the open world, 20 Sage's Will upgrades scattered throughout the map, 46 schema stones and schematics to find throughout the depths, 58 wells to explore for the well side quest, and that's not including all of the increased amounts of armor sets, side adventures, and so on. Let me just state my point plainly. This game has too much content. But you might say, Infinity, you're seriously gonna complain about this game giving you too much content to do? Yeah, absolutely I am. Just because a game has more content doesn't mean that it has more quality content. And in an open world game like Tears of the Kingdom, parsing the good from the bad is more nebulous and difficult to do than you'd initially think. Because if exploring the world is the main appeal of the game, then the side content in many ways becomes the main content. In both open world Zeldas, you'll be seamlessly switching between exploring, solving shrines, completing main quest objectives, doing Koroks, and clearing enemy camps. Basically, whatever is in front of you and catches your attention is the main quest. But as I was exposed to more repeated, low-quality content, I started to feel less like I was on this epic adventure, and more like I was just doing chores in a video game. While Breath of the Wild also had a problem with a lot of filler content, Tears has an even worse problem with it. I give a pass to the Koroks as it actively tells you that you don't need all of them. The reason that there is 1,000 Koroks is largely just so that you find them in many different areas. But with over 100 side quests, over 100 light routes, Hudson sign after Hudson sign, farming thousands of Poes, hundreds of Zoanite, killing the same few bosses over and over and over, I just gave up. I wanted to complete everything this game had to offer before I went to Hyrule Castle and beat Ganon. But I just stopped. At around 130 hours, which coincidentally was the same amount of time it took me to beat Breath of the Wild, I went to Hyrule Castle, I beat Ganon, and I put the game down. Still dozens of side quests and other things left unfinished. While I finished Breath of the Wild on somewhat of a high note, the opposite happened with Tears of the Kingdom. I stopped playing because I got bored. Many of these objectives have the opposite problem that the Ultrahand did. There's usually some extrinsic reward for fixing Hudson signs, exploring caves, and solving Korok puzzles. But the tasks of doing so were so boring and unengaging that I had no intrinsic motivation to do them. And to explain this and bring it down into one pointed example, I have to talk about the part of the game that just confuses me the most. Let's talk about the Great Fairy Fountains. Now, this is a critique that I'm levying against both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. It's just that I didn't try and fully engage with this system in Breath of the Wild, and I did when I ended up playing Tears. When it comes to tedium, when it comes to non-content filler bullshit, the Great Fairies take the cake. In order to upgrade your armor in both games, you have to travel to one of 4 Great Fairy Fountains. Each piece of armor you find throughout the world can be upgraded a total of 4 times. And in order to upgrade your armor from one level to the next, you need to trade the fairy several items found throughout the world. These are usually flavorful items that make sense for that specific piece of armor. To upgrade the fire armor, you'll need red choo-choo jellies and fire Kess wings. To upgrade the stealth armor, you need silent princess flowers and stealth-fin trouts. It's stuff that has a logic to it that feels quite satisfying to go and get. On paper, I actually love this upgrade system. It gives you a reason and a reward to go and explore the world. Beating enemies, picking up flowers, taking on mini-bosses, all now have a reward tied to doing them. If I go to the Great Fairy Fountain, find that I need to upgrade my armor with a bunch of ice-themed items, well now I have an objective to head to the mountains and find what I'm looking for. When I played Breath of the Wild, I almost exclusively used the stealth suit and the barbarian suit, and thus those were the only pieces of armor that I actively sought out upgrade materials for. It took a lot of Lionel kills to upgrade that barbarian armor, but I'd argue it paid off. Doing this, using the fairies to upgrade 1 or 2 item sets to the max, is a very fun aspect of the game, and it incentivizes and rewards your exploration. But with Tears of the Kingdom, I was really excited at the start. I had a different mindset going in. When I first got to the Fairy Fountain, considering I enjoyed, farming for the stealth armor in the last game, I figured I'd just upgrade all of my armor to the max, really go for that 100%. What I made in this moment was a grave mistake. I have a feeling that, like me in my Breath of the Wild playthrough, many people won't fully engage with this upgrade system, simply because accessing all 4 fairies is time-consuming in its own right, and many will be turned away when they don't have all the items needed to present to the fairy. Oftentimes in Breath of the Wild, I just wouldn't upgrade many pieces of armor, considering I just didn't know where to find the upgrade materials needed for it. I mean, I've never seen where I can get a Sizzlefin Trout or like an electric Danner, so I guess I'm just not upgrading this piece of armor. No big deal. But if you find that upgrading all of the armor goes into 100%ing the game, if you choose to engage with the system, you will know that it is fundamentally broken. The amount of items that the game requires you to gather in order to upgrade your armor are frankly absurd. This is made worse because side quests, merchants, and weapon fuses are also vying for your items. To give you an example of how much you have to grind to upgrade your armor in this game, let's look at the Hylian armor set. This is the first armor that you're available to both purchase and upgrade in the game. It's basic, bare bones, exactly what you'd expect from a starting item set. Like most armor sets in the game, it is comprised of 3 separate pieces: a headpiece, a chest piece, and a leg wear. So, let's say you want to upgrade just the single headpiece, the Hylian hood, all the way from basic level to level 4. What would that require of you? To upgrade your hood to level 1, you only need 5 Bokoblin horns. Bokoblins are the most commonly found enemy type in the game, and every time you slay one, there's basically a 100% chance of them dropping a horn. So, to upgrade your hood to level 1, you simply just need to kill 5 Bokoblins. This is an easy task. So far, no complaints from me. To upgrade your hood to level 2, you need 5 blue Bokoblin horns and 5 Bokoblin fangs. Blue Bokoblins are slightly stronger versions of their base form, and again, you only need to kill 5 of them. Most Bokoblins also drop 1 or more Boko fangs, so not a problem there either. It's an easy objective, still gets the pass for me. Level 3 is where things get interesting. You need 5 black Bokoblin horns, the next in line of difficulty for the game's main enemy, but you also need 3 Boko guts and 20 amber. The Boko guts are not a problem either. They're a common drop from any level of Bokoblin, meaning that if you killed the 15 total necessary to get this far, you surely already have 3 Boko guts lying around in your inventory. The interesting part is the 20 amber. Amber is one of the several rare minerals found throughout the game, albeit the most common of the rare minerals. That of course makes sense though for this armor set. The Hylian set is the game's simplest armor set, so using the worst of the rarest stones to upgrade it makes a lot of sense. 20 amber is a lot though. You farm amber by smashing ore deposits found throughout the caves in the overworld. Smashing an ore deposit has a 16% chance of dropping an amber. Rare ore deposits have an even lower chance of dropping them. Meaning that if you want to farm the 20 amber for this upgrade, you will need to smash roughly 140 ore deposits. Now, there are other ways to farm amber in the game. High-level enemies can drop them, killing the stone talus mini-bosses is a reliable way, plus sometimes they're found in chests. But my point is, 20 amber is a lot, and no matter how you try and obtain it, it's still going to take a lot of farming to get. This brings us to level 4. To go from level 3 of your Hylian hood to level 4, you need 5 silver Bokoblin horns, the most difficult of the Bokoblin forms, 5 Boko guts this time around, and another 30 amber. This brings the total amount of amber you need to take your Hylian hood from 0 all the way to 4 is 50. To gather 50 amber reliably, you need to break 350 ore deposits, and that's not including the roughly 20 Bokoblins of varying difficulty you need to kill. But remember, this was just to upgrade the hood. The Hylian chest piece and leg wear have the same leveling requirements as the hood does. Meaning if you want to fully upgrade this armor set, mind you, the worst and most common armor set in the game. You need to kill 60 bokoblins and gather 150 amber, which equates to breaking roughly 1,050 ore deposits. Farming for this set alone is worthy of criticism. It's an insane amount to grind. And remember, there are close to 100 pieces of armor in the game. What's worse is that amber is one of the most common upgrade materials. The total amount of amber that you would need to gather to satisfy all of the upgrade requirements for all of your armor sets is 865 pieces of amber, which is roughly 6,055 broken ore deposits. This is the very definition of the grind. When I set my goal to upgrade in the Hylian set to the max, I spent a few hours farming ore deposits, a lot of time killing taluses, and grinding as much as possible. And for these few hours, I did not enjoy the game at all. And this is completely a problem of scale. If instead of needing 150 amber to upgrade this set, I only needed around like 30 or so, then I would have nothing really to complain about. Setting out to kill a few bosses and mine in the mountains for 20 minutes is a pretty enjoyable objective. But when the game expects me to complete the same tasks over and over and over, my adventure fades into me just doing chores. But the Hylian armor set is hardly the worst offender on this list. That would go to the Fierce Deity armor set. Let's talk about dragon farming. One of the most magical experiences in Breath of the Wild, and I'm sure many people will relate to me on this, is discovering your first elemental dragon in the overworld. One night I was exploring around the ruins in Hyrule Field, and off in the distance by Lake Hylia, I saw a massive serpent breaching the water and ascending towards the sky. I stopped in the middle of a battle to rush straight towards the lake, hoping the dragon wouldn't fly away by the time I got there. When you get close to the dragon, the music changes to this mystic, serene melody with a majestic string instrument playing in the background. The wind around you swells up, creating gusts of air that you can use to get closer to the dragon. And this whole time, the dragon completely ignores you, as if you're so beneath it that it just pays no attention to you. I eventually shot it with an arrow, seeing if it would trigger a boss fight. It didn't. It simply swam through the sky, away from me, and dropped a single item on the floor. A Farash's scale. This entire sequence was just magical for me. The entire presentation of the dragon, from the animations to the music to the lack of hostility, give the impression that you just stumbled upon something unique and divine. And as you explore Hyrule, you'll encounter a total of 3 ancient dragons: Farash, the lightning dragon, Dinral, the fire dragon, and Nidra, the ice dragon. It turns out that the scale that Farash dropped was actually a really useful item. While playing Breath of the Wild, I was upgrading my item sets when I noticed that one of the pieces of armor needed a scale of Farash to upgrade to the next level. I decided to upgrade the piece only for the next level to require a piece of Farash's horn. Enter one of the worst aspects of these game's late games: dragon farming. You see, each of these 3 dragons that roam the world can drop one of 4 items depending on where you hit them. Shoot them in the main body, you get a scale. Shoot their mouth, you get a fang. Shoot their claws, well, you get a claw. And shoot their elemental crowns, and you get a horn. The dilemma is that when you shoot one of these dragons, they will only drop 1 item before flying away. What this means is that if you want their items for upgrades, you will have to encounter the dragons over and over, farming them for parts. This is, to me, the worst example of the grind in Breath of the Wild. It took this magical experience of encountering this celestial dragon and turned it into a route chore, where I kept scalping it for parts to upgrade my armor. And remember, it's not like this is a boss battle or a puzzle. You are simply heading to a location, hitting these things with an arrow over and over and over again. This is about as non-gameplay as you can get. In Breath of the Wild, these dragons are all set to spawn in certain locations at certain times based on the in-game clock, meaning that you could travel to where they were supposed to spawn, set a campfire, reset until the desired time, and boom, the dragon would spawn in front of you, ready to give you whatever part you needed. In Tears of the Kingdom, however, they changed the way that the dragons work. The dragons are back, baby, and largely the same as they were in Breath of the Wild. Except this time, they no longer reset at different points of the day. Instead, they follow a set path around the map and constantly travel around that path. I think the developers tried to solve the issue of people just using campfires in Breath of the Wild to farm dragon parts. So in Tears, when a dragon drops an item, you now have to wait 10 real-world minutes until it will spawn another. This makes it more time consuming to farm dragons, as you now have to locate where they are in their set path, and then give about a 10-minute buffer before you get your next part. This brings us to the Fierce Deity armor set. To upgrade the Fierce Deity mask all the way to level 4, you will need one of each of the 4 Dinral item drops. That means 1 scale, 1 claw, 1 fang, and 1 horn. That's 4 times of locating Dinral and farming his items. For the chest and legs, it's 1 of each from the other 2 dragons, meaning that to fully upgrade this item set, you need 12 total dragon parts, each of which can only drop 1 at a time. Because it takes 10 minutes for dragons to reset, that's a total of 120 minutes or 2 straight hours of waiting for dragons to farm. And yes, other armor in the game uses dragon parts as part of the upgrade system. This is again nothing but grinding for grinding's sake. Encountering a dragon once is a memorable experience. But since we already encountered them in Breath of the Wild, now they only serve as item drops in the sequel. Having to farm each of these dragons upwards of 7 times was actively unfun and a great waste of my time. This isn't even to talk about how tedious it is once you have the parts and you present them to the Great Fairy. You can only upgrade 1 piece of armor at a time, with an animation which takes a few seconds to skip between every single upgrade. I spent what must have been over an hour of in-game time just pressing the button to upgrade my materials. Why we can't queue multiple upgrades at once is just unacceptable to me. Having to manually watch the fairy play an animation every single time I wanted to upgrade a piece of armor was really infuriating. At around the 3rd set of armor that I tried to upgrade to the max, I had to stop myself and ask, did the developers of this game really intend for me to upgrade all of the armor sets? And with the absurd requirements, whether it's hundreds of rubies, sapphires, diamonds, ambers, or dragon parts, I think the answer has to be no. And I felt this way about most of the content in the game. Am I really supposed to do 80 President Hudson sign puzzles? Am I really supposed to find all 46 schema stones, go through nearly 60 wells with basically no content at the bottom of them? Even though they aren't explicit about it like the Korok seeds, I think the answer is again, no. Which again leads into, how are you supposed to approach the endgame of Tears of the Kingdom? Once you beat the main campaign, you're left with caves, shrines, armor upgrades. The point at which you stop playing the game is simply when you get bored with it. This game, far more than Breath of the Wild, becomes about the grind. I felt compelled to finish all the shrines, but once I was left with incredibly low-effort content of caves and fetch quests, I simply had no desire to keep playing. I was no longer on an adventure. I was just doing chores in a video game. Alright, before we get to the end, I wanted to dedicate a section to just talk about things that I couldn't fit into the rest of the script for the video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through a list of all the things that I had to say about this game that were positive, then we'll go through and do some of the more negative things that didn't make it to my other critiques. Alright, let's start with the positive stuff. The Colgera boss theme slaps, absolutely phenomenal. Overall, the sound design in this game, still on point, really great. Pen, the character from the stable side quests, is an unbelievably great character. Every time he just goes, "So long!" and then flies away. Oh, love this guy, would die for him, he's awesome. On the topic of bird-themed NPCs, I just really love Tulin's character, he's just a fun little guy. The health bar going off the screen in the middle of the Ganondorf fight is just like so raw, absolutely loved it. And then the fact that like he's not invulnerable, you actually have to take down all that health, excellent decision, love this fight overall. The Flux Construct battle, genuinely a creative fight. I love how it incorporates all the different abilities of the game. Raru's character design is unbelievably horny and I'm here for it. I like that we keep giving Link twinky little outfits to wear, this is a good trend. The Kilton enemy trophy displays at the end of the game were really cool, it was just fun to set these up. Overall, the side adventures were a big step up in the side content, and they should have just removed the side quests and kept these. These were a lot higher quality of side content in this game. A lot of open world games take place in like a post-apocalyptic setting, and while I liked that vibe in Breath of the Wild, I really loved how alive Hyrule felt in this game. The whole like marbled chuck roast, like crack analogy in the Goron Mountain is pretty interesting, and I wish they would have done more with that. Enemy animations remain expressive and are one of the highlights of playing around with the game's mechanics and enemy encampments. Alright, let's talk about a few more negative critiques and nitpicks. The Mukdarok boss fight. It has this gunk ability to it where it sort of transforms into a big shark, and I like this phase, but when I saw it, I figured there would be more phases, like maybe he makes like an ink giant squid, or maybe like one of the manta rays from like that hotel level in Super Mario Sunshine. I was disappointed when it was just the shark. The final dungeon leading down to Ganondorf is an absolute joke. It is terrible. The only good thing about it is the music as it grows in intensity as you get to the bottom. For future playthroughs, there are just too many roadblocks to unlocking what you want out of the gate. The Great Fairy Fountains are a pretty good example. The summons clogged up the screen and were a genuine pain to use while exploring. The fact that you couldn't quick toggle them off is insane to me. The Gleeok is just a worse late game mini boss than the Lionel was. While the Gleeok fight offers more spectacle, the Lionel fight is just much more mechanically engaging, and I wish we would have got another enemy like that in this game. The fact that they play the same cutscene after you beat each of the main bosses and you just see it from a slightly different perspective is pretty frustrating. On that note, the story is just as bad as the last game in this one. Really not great. With the revival of Ganondorf, I can't believe that the Gerudo quest didn't involve the relationship between Ganon and the Gerudo people in any way. Before you get Yunobo, it takes way too long to clear out rocks and caves. I really wish the compendium cleared when you killed an enemy or picked up an item instead of having to take a picture of it every time. I know some people will like this, but I just didn't at all. Sidon gets married. Having to pick up Poes individually was just annoying. There are too many forms of currency in the depths. Zoanite, Zonai charges, crystalline charges, Poes. It all felt like too much. Waiting at Hylia statues to upgrade hearts and stamina still takes way too long. The weapon fusions were often too goofy, and I think a fusion system similar to that of like Kirby and the Crystal Shards would have worked a lot better here. I wish there was a dedicated cookbook that could be filled out as you made recipes. The old maps that you'd find in the sky should show you the location of an armor piece that you haven't unlocked yet, so they're not meaningless if you already found that specific piece of armor tied to that old map. In the late game, the weapon durability system incentivizes you to just run past enemies still and not use your best armor. And yes, there are new enemies, but because they're spread out over a map that's double the size as the last, enemy variety is still definitely a problem here. Also, Horriblins, Likes, Gibdos, Constructs, Aracudas, and Evermeans are all pretty underwhelming enemy types. The only new decent enemy are the boss Bokoblins. And that's all the side stuff and nitpicks I have to say. I want to end by talking about a wider point. I talked at the start of this video about the metric of amount of content to dollar ratio, and I think it's relevant to bring that back up. You see, there's a difference between content and meaningful experiences. Tears of the Kingdom is the game with probably the most amount of content you could ever get out of a full price game, and I genuinely mean that. But I want you to think, if you already played Breath of the Wild, how many meaningful, unique experiences did you have while playing Tears of the Kingdom? Breath of the Wild was full of them for me. Getting out of the Great Plateau, discovering Farosh in Lake Hylia, finding that spirit horse on top of Mount Satori, traversing through the maze in Akala only to be bombarded with guardians at the bottom, exploring Hyrule Castle when I was way too underleveled, saving Nidra from corruption, fighting my first Molduga. Heck, I love the 7 heroine statue quest, getting lost in the sandstorms, making my way to Eventide Isle, discovering the Leviathan skeletons. The list just goes on and on and on. But throughout my entire playthrough of Tears of the Kingdom, I can only think of 2 moments that really stuck out to me as unique. One was me discovering the Spirit Temple, which, as I said earlier, only really led to disappointment. The other was stumbling across a group of Gloomhands. These spooky monsters dealt a ton of damage, and the only way I could beat them was by using all of my bomb arrows at my disposal. Eventually I did beat them, and to my surprise, arising from their gloom was an entirely new boss, the Phantom Ganon mid-boss. I took probably 15 tries to kill this guy, but eventually I did beat him, and I had to use up every last one of my swords in the process. After that experience though, I'd fight another 20 of these guys. And this was even before the boss was used as a main quest boss. Like the dragons, a meaningful experience becomes a routine activity. I don't care how much content a game has. I don't care how many caves they put in, how big the depths is, how many times they copy and paste the same bokoblin enemy camp from the last game. What I'm looking for in a game isn't how many hours I put into it, it's how many meaningful experiences I can get in those hours. I've played 5-hour games with more artistic merit than the entirety of Tears of the Kingdom. This game is not Breath of the Wild 2, it's Breath of the Wild Extended Edition. If you want to replay the same content, fight the same bokoblins, go get the Master Sword again, go to the same 4 villages, farm the same dragons, then Tears of the Kingdom is the game for you. It's something to do in the background. It's content. But if you're looking for something that evolves the artistic ideas and expressions of Breath of the Wild, something that will provide you with a separate, meaningful experience, then I can't at all recommend Tears of the Kingdom. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I know video games are not something I usually review, but I had a lot of fun with this one. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter at InfinityInkCom1. And thank you guys so much for watching.